The rain was hammering down like bullets when I realized my own son had dumped me at this godforsaken gas station, like a piece of trash he couldn't be bothered to dispose of properly. There I was, 68 years old, clutching my worn purse and watching. The storm raged through the fluorescent-lit windows of Murphy's Gas and Go, while my son Blake and his wife Karina drove off into the night without a backward glance. You might think you know where this story is headed. You might think this is just another tale about ungrateful offspring and a forgotten mother. But let me tell you something. Sometimes the people who are supposed to love you most are the ones who show you exactly how little you mean to them. And sometimes, just sometimes, that revelation becomes the catalyst for the most liberating decision of your life. What happened to me over the next few days didn't just change my perspective on family, it changed my entire will. And when my son and daughter-in-law came crawling back with their hands out, begging for forgiveness and financial help, they discovered that some bridges once burned can never be rebuilt. They left me out in the rain that night, but I made sure they'd be the ones standing in the cold when my lawyer finished reading my final wishes. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Daphne Russell, and until 3 months ago, I believed that family meant something. I believed that the woman who had sacrificed her career, her dreams, and her financial security to raise her son would be treated with basic human decency when she needed help most. I believed that 68 years of living, loving, and giving would count for something when push came to shove. I was wrong about all of it. The evening that shattered every illusion I'd held about my family started like any other Tuesday in March. I was living in my modest apartment on Cedar Street in the small town of Willowbrook, the same place I'd called home for 12 years since my husband Frank passed away. The walls were painted a soft lavender that reminded me of the garden Frank and I had tended together, and every surface was covered with photographs of Blake, my only son, his wife Karina, and their 2 teenagers who barely acknowledged my existence, despite all the birthday checks and Christmas gifts I'd sent over the years. Those smiling faces looked down at me every morning as I made my coffee in the same blue mug Frank had bought me for our anniversary 25 years ago. I'd smile back, believing those pictures represented people who loved me, people who would be there if I ever truly needed them. How naive I was to think that blood meant anything more than shared DNA. The call came at 7:30 p.m., just as I was settling in to watch my evening programs with a cup of chamomile tea. Blake's voice carried that tone I'd learned to recognize over the years, the one that meant he needed something but was trying to sound casual about it. There was an urgency underneath his carefully controlled words that immediately put me on edge. "Mom, we need to talk," he said, and I could hear Karina's voice in the background, sharp and impatient as always. "There's been an emergency with your apartment building." I set down my teacup with shaking hands, immediately concerned. In my 12 years living in the Willowbrook Gardens complex, we'd never had anything more serious than a broken elevator or a power outage during summer storms. "What kind of emergency, sweetheart?" The landlord called me directly. Apparently, there's been a catastrophic pipe burst in the building's main water line. They're saying it could take months to repair, and the whole building needs to be evacuated immediately. Something about structural damage, possible mold issues, and major safety concerns. My heart sank as I looked around my little apartment. At all my belongings, my memories, the life I'd carefully built in this space after Frank's death. The bookshelves filled with romance novels and gardening magazines, the china cabinet displaying the good dishes we'd received as wedding gifts, the rocking chair where I'd nursed Blake as a baby, and where I now sat every evening to read. Tonight? But Blake, this is so sudden. Where am I supposed to go? All my things. That's exactly what Karina and I have been discussing, he interrupted, his voice taking on that patient tone adults use with confused elderly people. "We think we've found the perfect solution. There's this wonderful place called Sunset Gardens over in Maplewood. It's an assisted living community, very well regarded, and they happened to have immediate availability: Sunset Gardens. The name alone made my stomach clench with dread. I'd heard whispers about that place at the senior center, a sterile, institutional facility where elderly people went to wait for the end, the kind of place that smelled like disinfectant and broken dreams, where residents sat in wheelchairs staring at television screens, forgotten by families who visited twice a year out of obligation. Blake, honey, I don't need assisted living. I'm perfectly capable of taking care of myself. I drive, I cook, I manage my own finances. Can't I just stay with you and Karina until I find another apartment? It would only be temporary. The pause that followed lasted just a beat too long, and I felt something cold and sharp settle in my chest like a splinter of ice. In that silence, I heard the truth that my son was too cowardly to speak directly. Mom, that's not really... Our house is in complete chaos right now. We're in the middle of a major renovation. The guest room is completely gutted. There's construction dust everywhere, and with the kids' demanding schedules and Karina's new promotion at work, having a house guest just isn't practical right now. There it was, the word that would haunt me for weeks afterward: practical. Their mother's homelessness wasn't practical for their comfortable suburban lifestyle. I wasn't practical. After 28 years of putting Blake's needs before my own, of working double shifts as a nurse to pay for his college education, of babysitting his teenagers every weekend for years without ever asking for gas money, I had become impractical. Well, what about a hotel? I suggested desperately, grasping for any alternative to the institutional prison he was proposing. Just temporarily until the building repairs are finished, or until I can find another place. Mom, be realistic. Hotels are incredibly expensive, and this repair situation could drag on for weeks or even months. The landlord wasn't very optimistic about the timeline. Sunset Gardens is the smart choice here. It's affordable with your Medicare benefits. They'll take care of all your daily needs, and you won't have to worry about cooking or cleaning or maintaining an apartment. Really, when you think about it, this might be a blessing in disguise. The way he said it, bright and cheerful and completely convinced of his own righteousness, made it sound almost appealing, as if being warehoused with other discarded elderly people was some kind of vacation opportunity rather than the death of my independence and dignity. Blake, I've never even seen this place. What if I don't like it? What if... Mom, you're overthinking. This. It's a nice facility with activities and social opportunities. You might actually prefer it to living alone in that cramped apartment. Plus, think about how much safer you'll be with medical staff available around the clock. I wasn't overthinking anything. I was a 68-year-old woman whose son was railroading her into an institution against her will, using a convenient emergency as justification. But I'd spent so many years deferring to Blake's judgment, trusting his decisions about what was best for our family, that I found myself nodding along even as every instinct screamed that something was wrong. Will you help me pack? Will you be there when I move in? Will you visit regularly? Another pause, shorter this time but equally telling. Of course, Mom. We'll come pick you up in an hour and get you all settled tonight. Once you're comfortable, we'll work out a visiting schedule that makes sense for everyone. I should have pressed for specifics. I should have demanded to see Sunset Gardens before agreeing to live there. I should have called the landlord myself to verify this sudden emergency. But at 68, with my world crumbling around me and my son presenting himself as my only lifeline, I chose to trust the boy I'd raised to be honest and caring. Blake arrived at exactly 8:30 p.m. with a rented moving truck, alone. No Karina offering moral support. No grandkids helping their grandmother pack up her life. No family solidarity in the face of this supposed crisis. Just my son, checking his expensive watch every few minutes and clearly eager to complete this unpleasant task as quickly as possible. "Where's Karina?" I asked, as we loaded my hastily packed suitcases and a few precious possessions into the back of the truck. "And the kids?" "They're at home. You know how it is. School night, homework to supervise. Karina's got an early meeting tomorrow. Everyone wanted to be here, but with such short notice, I didn't know how it was, actually. When Blake was young and we faced family emergencies, we faced them together. When someone you loved needed help, you rearranged your schedule, you made sacrifices, you showed up. But apparently, those were old-fashioned values that no longer applied in Blake's modern practical world. As we drove through the dark country roads toward Maplewood, Blake kept the radio on just loud enough to discourage conversation. Classic rock from the 70s filled the space between us. Music from a time when families actually took care of each other. I stared out the passenger window, watching my familiar world disappear behind us in the darkness, trying not to think about how quickly and completely my entire life had been uprooted. The rain started falling just as we turned onto Highway 12, fat drops that splattered against the windshield and reflected the truck's headlights like tears. I took it as an omen, though I didn't yet understand just how prophetic that storm would prove to be. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Blake, I said as we passed the last streetlight before entering the long stretch of rural highway. Are you absolutely sure about this place? I'm nervous about making such a big change without seeing it first. It's fine, Mom. Clean, safe, plenty of activities and social interaction. You'll probably end up loving it more than that isolated apartment anyway. This could be the best thing that ever happened to you. His confidence should have been reassuring, but something in his tone made me feel like he was trying to convince himself as much as me. 20 minutes later, my worst fears would be confirmed when we pulled into the parking lot of Murphy's Gas and Go, and I realized that my son had been lying to me about everything. To understand how completely my son betrayed me that night, you need to understand who I was before everything fell apart. My name is Daphne Russell, and for 68 years, I had built my entire identity around being the kind of woman who put family first, who sacrificed without complaint, who gave until it hurt and then gave some more. I wasn't born into wealth or privilege. My parents, Archie and Millie Coleman, were hardworking people who ran a small bakery in downtown Willowbrook. They taught me that love was shown through actions, not words, through getting up at 4 a.m. to knead dough, through working 16-hour days to keep the business afloat, through putting every penny back into providing for your family's future. Those lessons shaped everything about who I became. When I met Frank Russell at a church social when I was 22, I thought I'd found my soulmate. He was a gentleman who worked as a telephone repair technician, steady and reliable in ways that felt like safety after growing up watching my parents struggle financially. We married 6 months later in a simple ceremony at St. Mark's Methodist Church with my mother's homemade cake and flowers from our own garden. Frank and I spent our first 10 years of marriage trying to have a baby, month after month of hope, followed by disappointment, of expensive fertility treatments we couldn't afford, of watching other couples effortlessly build the families we desperately wanted. When I finally got pregnant at 32, Blake felt like a miracle. I remember lying in the hospital bed after his birth, holding this perfect little human and promising him that I would never let him feel unloved or unwanted the way I had felt during those lonely years of infertility. That promise shaped every decision I made for the next 36 years. When Blake was 6 months old, Frank was injured in a workplace accident that left him with chronic back problems and limited earning capacity. Instead of wallowing in self-pity, I enrolled in nursing school while working nights as a hospital aide and caring for Blake during the day. I survived on 3 hours of sleep and pure determination, fueled by the belief that sacrifice was what mothers did for their families. For the next 25 years, I worked as a registered nurse at Willowbrook General Hospital, often pulling double shifts to make ends meet. Frank did his best with odd jobs and part-time work, but his injury limited his options. I became the primary breadwinner while also managing all the household responsibilities. the childcare, the emotional labor that kept our family functioning. I never complained. I never made Frank feel guilty about his limitations, or Blake feel responsible for our financial struggles. I just worked harder, slept less, and convinced myself that this was what love looked like. Endless giving without expectation of return. Blake was a bright boy, but not an easy one. He struggled in school, not because he wasn't smart, but because he seemed to lack motivation and discipline. Other parents might have let their teenagers face natural consequences for poor grades or bad behavior. I hired tutors I couldn't afford, attended every parent-teacher conference, and spent countless evenings helping him with homework, while my own exhaustion made my hands shake. When Blake announced in his junior year of high school that he wanted to go to State University to study business, I didn't hesitate. The tuition was far beyond our means, but I took out loans, picked up extra shifts, and even sold my mother's engagement ring to help cover expenses. Frank worried that we were overextending ourselves financially, but I insisted that Blake's education was worth any sacrifice. He's our only shot at breaking the cycle, I told Frank. If Blake gets his degree and builds a successful career, he'll be able to take care of us when we're older. This is an investment in all our futures. Blake graduated with a business degree and immediately landed a good job at a marketing firm in the county seat. Within 5 years, he'd been promoted to regional manager and was earning more money than Frank and I had ever dreamed of. I felt vindicated in every sacrifice I'd made, every extra shift I'd worked, every dollar I'd stretched to support his education. When Blake announced his engagement to Karina Foster, a sharp-tongued woman from a wealthy family who made it clear she considered Blake a step down socially, I bit my tongue and welcomed her with open arms. When they wanted an expensive wedding that they expected us to help pay for, I liquidated my modest retirement savings without complaint. When they bought their first house and needed help with the down payment, I took out a second mortgage on our little home. Frank questioned these decisions, gently suggesting that maybe Blake and Karina should learn to live within their means. But I always defended our son, always found reasons why helping him was the right thing to do. He's building something, Frank, I'd say. He's creating the kind of life we always wanted for him. Once he's established, he'll be able to help us. Frank passed away suddenly from a heart attack when Blake was 28 and I was 56. The medical bills from his final hospitalization, combined with the debts I'd accumulated helping Blake over the years, left me in a precarious financial position. I had to sell our family home and move into the small apartment on Cedar Street, drastically downsizing my life to make ends meet on my nurse's pension. Blake and Karina had just welcomed their first teenager, a daughter they named Ashley. When I suggested that I could move closer to them to help with babysitting and elder care, Karina made it clear that my services wouldn't be needed. "We can afford professional childcare," she said with the kind of smile that cut like a knife. "We wouldn't want to burden you with that kind of responsibility at your age." At 56, I was hardly decrepit, but I accepted their decision and focused on being the best long-distance grandmother I could be. I sent generous birthday and Christmas gifts, even though my fixed income made such generosity a real strain. I drove the 2 hours to their house every few months for brief visits, always calling ahead to make sure it was convenient, always bringing homemade food and small presents for the kids. Their second youngster, a son named Connor, was born 2 years later. I offered again to help, and again was politely but firmly declined. Blake and Karina were building their perfect suburban life, complete with a house in the best school district and every modern convenience. There wasn't room in that picture for a working-class grandmother who might remind them of more humble origins. Over the years, I watched my granddaughter Ashley grow from a sweet toddler into a sullen teenager who barely acknowledged my existence. Connor followed the same pattern, polite but distant, clearly coached to view me as an obligation rather than family. Their Christmas thank you notes for gifts became increasingly perfunctory and eventually stopped coming altogether. Blake's visits became less frequent and more rushed. He'd stop by my apartment for an hour on Sunday afternoons, usually when Karina was busy with something else, and we'd sit in my tiny living room making awkward conversation about his work, the weather, and safe topics that didn't require real emotional connection. I told myself this was normal. Adult offspring got busy with their own lives. Modern families were more scattered and independent than previous generations. Blake loved me, even if he didn't show it the way I might have preferred. But deep down, I knew something had shifted in our relationship. Blake treated me more like a distant relative than his mother, someone he felt obligated to check on occasionally but didn't particularly enjoy spending time with. Karina barely tolerated my presence, making it clear through subtle comments and body language that she viewed me as an unwelcome reminder of Blake's less sophisticated background. Still, I held on to the belief that family bonds were unbreakable. When push came to shove, when I really needed them, surely Blake would remember everything I'd done for him. Surely the son I'd sacrificed everything to raise would step up when his mother faced a crisis. The apartment building emergency that Blake described so urgently that March evening never actually happened. I would learn later that there had been no pipe burst, no structural damage, no evacuation order. Blake had fabricated the entire crisis because he and Karina had made a decision about my future, and they needed a way to implement it without appearing to be the villains. They had decided that I was becoming inconvenient. At 68, I was still healthy and independent, but I was also alone and financially vulnerable. In their minds, it was only a matter of time before I became a burden on their comfortable lifestyle. Better to warehouse me in an institution, now, while I was still functional enough to adapt, than to deal with a real crisis later. The night Blake drove me through the rain toward what I thought was my new home at Sunset Gardens, I was still the woman who believed that love meant endless sacrifice, that family was forever, that the people you raised and nurtured would naturally want to care for you in return. By morning, that woman would be gone forever, replaced by someone harder and wiser and far less willing to be taken advantage of. But first, I had to experience the full magnitude of my son's betrayal, had to feel the crushing weight of realizing that everything I'd believed about our relationship had been a carefully maintained illusion. The rain that started falling as we drove toward Maplewood wasn't just weather. It was the universe washing away every naive assumption I'd ever made about the nature of family love. 20 minutes into our drive toward what I believed would be my temporary new home at Sunset Gardens, Blake suddenly pulled into the parking. Lot of Murphy's Gas and Go. The neon sign flickered weakly in the rain that had intensified during our journey, casting sickly pink and blue light across the cracked asphalt. This wasn't exactly the kind of neighborhood I'd expected to find a reputable assisted living facility in. "Why are we stopping here?" I asked, peering through the rain-streaked windshield at the rundown truck stop. The building looked like it. Hadn't been updated since the 1980s, with faded siding and windows covered in advertisements for cigarettes and energy drinks. A few long-haul trucks sat in the parking spaces designed for big rigs, their drivers probably catching a few hours of sleep before continuing their journeys. Blake turned off the engine and sat for a moment, his hands gripping the steering wheel. In the dim light from the gas station's fluorescent signs, I could see tension in his jaw, a muscle twitching like he was working up the courage to say something difficult. "Mom, I need to tell you something about Sunset Gardens. There's been a slight complication with the timing." My stomach dropped. "What kind of complication?" "Well, it turns out they don't actually have immediate availability tonight. The administrator called while we were driving and explained that the room they thought would be ready has some maintenance issues that need to be resolved first. Nothing major, just some carpet replacement and a plumbing fixture that needs updating." I stared at him, trying to process this information. "So where am I supposed to stay tonight?" "Blake, you said this was all arranged?" "It is arranged, just not exactly the way I initially explained." He was speaking faster now, the words tumbling out like he wanted to get through this conversation as quickly as possible. The administrator at Sunset Gardens actually recommended, "This place is a temporary solution. Murphy's Gas and Go has clean, safe rooms they rent to people in transition situations. It's like an extended stay motel, really." I looked out at the gas station again, noticing details I'd missed before. The cracked concrete, the overflowing dumpster near the side of the building, the hand-lettered sign in the window that read, "Rooms available, weekly rates, no parties." This was where my son planned to leave his 68-year-old mother. "Blake, this doesn't look like the kind of place where I should be staying alone. It looks unsafe." "Mom, you're being dramatic. Murphy's a good guy who's been running this place for 20 years. The Sunset Gardens people wouldn't have recommended it if it wasn't legitimate. Besides, it's only for a few days until they get your permanent room ready." He was already getting out of the truck, clearly eager to complete this transaction and escape back to his comfortable suburban life. I followed him reluctantly, my legs unsteady with shock and growing apprehension. The rain soaked through my thin jacket within seconds, and I had to grab Blake's arm to keep from slipping on the wet pavement. The interior of Murphy's Gas and Go was exactly what you'd expect from a truck stop that had seen better days. Harsh fluorescent lighting buzzed overhead, casting everything in an unflattering greenish glow. The linoleum floor was clean but worn, marked with scuff marks from decades of work boots and sneakers. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with motor, oil, beef jerky, energy drinks, and the kind of processed snacks that could survive a nuclear apocalypse. Behind the counter stood a man I assumed must be Murphy himself. He appeared to be in his early 60s, with graying hair and weathered hands that spoke of a lifetime of hard work. His flannel shirt was clean but faded, and his eyes held the kind of weary kindness you sometimes find in people who've seen enough of life's unfairness to develop genuine compassion for others. "You must be Blake Russell," Murphy said, extending a calloused hand to my son. "We spoke on the phone earlier about accommodations for your mother." "That's right," Blake replied, shaking Murphy's hand with the kind of firm grip he'd learned in business school. "I appreciate you being able to help us out on such short notice." Murphy's eyes shifted to me, taking in my confused expression and the way I was clutching my purse like a lifeline. Something flickered across his face. Concern, maybe, or recognition of a situation that didn't quite add up. "Ma'am," he said gently, "your son explained that you need a place to stay while waiting for an opening at the assisted living place over in Maplewood. The room's nothing fancy, but it's clean and safe. Private bathroom, small kitchenette, cable TV." I managed a weak smile, still trying to reconcile this reality with what Blake had told me about emergency evacuations and temporary arrangements. "How long do people usually stay here?" "Depends on their situation," Murphy replied carefully. "Some folks are just passing through for a night or two. Others might stay a few weeks while they're between more permanent housing. I try to be flexible with people who are dealing with difficult circumstances." Blake pulled out his wallet and counted out a stack of bills. "This should cover a week," he said, pressing the money into Murphy's weathered palm. "My mother's very low maintenance. She won't cause any problems." The casual way Blake discussed me, as if I weren't standing right there, made my cheeks burn with embarrassment. I wasn't a piece of luggage to be stored temporarily until a more convenient arrangement could be made. I was his mother, the woman, who had worked herself to exhaustion to pay for his education and launch his career. "Blake," I said quietly, "can we talk privately for a moment?" "What about, Mom? Murphy needs to get you settled so he can close up for the night." The dismissal in his voice was unmistakable. He wasn't interested in my concerns or questions. He just wanted to complete this transaction and leave. Murphy cleared his throat. "The room's upstairs," he said, producing a key from behind the counter. "Number 3, at the end of the hall. There's a vending machine on the landing if you need snacks, and the bathroom's shared, but it's kept very clean." Shared bathroom. I hadn't shared a bathroom with strangers since my college dormitory 46 years ago. But Blake was already heading toward the door marked stairs, carrying one of my suitcases like he couldn't wait to be rid of it. The stairway was narrow and dimly lit, with worn carpet that had probably been installed sometime during the Carter administration. At the top, a short hallway stretched to the left, with 4 doors marked with faded plastic numbers. The smell of industrial disinfectant couldn't quite mask underlying odors of cigarettes and fried food. Room 3 was at the far end, exactly as Murphy had said. Blake unlocked the door and stepped inside, flipping on a light switch that revealed the space I would be calling home for the foreseeable future. The room was small but clean, dominated by a double bed covered with a faded, floral bedspread that had probably been cheerful once upon a time. A small table and chair sat beneath the single window, which looked out onto the parking lot and the highway beyond. In one corner, a compact kitchenette featured a hot plate, a mini refrigerator, and a sink barely large enough to wash dishes. See? Blake said, setting my suitcase on the bed with obvious relief. It's not so bad. Kind of cozy, really. I walked to the window and looked out at the rain-soaked parking lot, at the 18-wheelers and the highway stretching into darkness. This was my view now. This was my life. Blake, please, I'm begging you. Don't leave me here. I can sleep on your couch. I can stay in your basement. I can pay for a hotel room. Anything but this. He checked his expensive watch, the one Karina had given him for his last promotion. Mom, you're being over-dramatic. It's a clean, safe room with everything you need. Murphy seems like a decent guy who'll keep an eye on you. And it's only temporary. Until Sunset Gardens gets your permanent room ready. How long is temporary? A few days. A week at most. I'll call them first thing Monday morning to check on the status. It was Friday night. Even if he called Monday morning, even if there really was a room being prepared for me at Sunset Gardens, I was looking at a minimum of 3 nights in this truck stop motel room, possibly longer. Will you visit me here? Will you call to check on me? Blake was already edging toward the door. Of course, Mom. Once you're settled and I know you're comfortable, we'll work out a regular communication schedule. He gave me a quick, perfunctory hug that felt more like an obligation than genuine affection. Try to get some rest. This has been a stressful day for all of us. And then he was gone, his footsteps echoing in the narrow hallway as he hurried back down the stairs. I stood at the window and watched him emerge from the building, jogging through the rain to his truck without looking back. The engine started. Immediately, headlights cutting through the darkness as he pulled out of the parking lot and disappeared down Highway 12. I was alone in a truck stop motel room, 68 years old, and abandoned by the son I had sacrificed everything to raise. The rain drummed against my window, and somewhere in the distance, I could hear the rumble of truck engines and the lonely sound of tires on wet pavement. In the harsh fluorescent light of room 3, surrounded by my hastily packed belongings, and the smell of industrial-strength cleaning products, I finally began to understand that everything Blake had told me about emergency evacuations and temporary arrangements had been lies. This wasn't a crisis response or a temporary inconvenience. This was abandonment, pure and simple. My son had gotten tired of feeling obligated to check on his aging mother, and he'd found a way to warehouse me where I wouldn't be his problem anymore. The elaborate story about pipe bursts and building evacuations had been a convenient fiction, designed to make his conscience feel better about what he was really doing. As I sat on the edge of that faded floral bedspread, listening to the rain and the distant highway traffic, I realized that the woman who had trusted Blake completely, who had believed in the fundamental goodness of family bonds, was gone forever. What I didn't yet know was that this moment of abandonment would become the catalyst for the most empowering transformation of my life. I spent my first night at Murphy's Gas and Go staring at the water-stained ceiling tiles, listening to the rumble of 18-wheelers pulling in and out of the parking lot below. Every few hours, I'd hear footsteps in the hallway, doors opening and closing, the sound of the shared bathroom down the hall being used by other temporary residents of this forgotten corner of the world. Sleep was impossible. Every time I closed, My eyes, I replayed the events of the evening, searching for clues I should have caught, red flags I should have noticed, the way Blake had avoided eye contact when he talked about the building emergency, the fact that he'd arrived alone, without Karina or the grandkids, the suspiciously convenient timing of everything. By 6 a.m., I couldn't stand the uncertainty anymore. I needed to know the truth about my apartment building, needed to confirm whether the emergency that had uprooted my entire life was real or just another one of Blake's carefully constructed lies. I called the main office of Willowbrook Gardens from the ancient rotary phone on the nightstand, my hands shaking as I dialed the number I'd memorized years ago. Mrs. Patterson in the office had always been friendly and helpful during my 12 years as a tenant. If there really had been a catastrophic pipe burst requiring immediate evacuation, she would know about it. Willowbrook Gardens, this is Helen speaking, came the familiar voice. Helen, this is Daphne Russell from apartment 3B. I'm calling because my son told me there was an emergency evacuation last night due to a pipe burst, and I wanted to check on the status of repairs. The silence on the other end of the line lasted just long enough to confirm my worst fears. I'm sorry, Mrs. Russell, but I'm not sure what you're referring to. We haven't had any emergency situations recently. No pipe bursts, no evacuations. Is everything all right with your apartment? The words hit me like a physical blow, driving all the air from my lungs. Are you certain? No water damage? No structural issues? Absolutely certain. I was here until 7 last night doing month-end paperwork, and everything was completely normal. Mrs. Russell, where are you calling from? Are you okay? I hung up without answering, my hand trembling so badly I could barely replace the receiver in its cradle. The confirmation of what I'd already suspected deep down felt like being kicked in the stomach. Blake had lied about everything. The emergency, the evacuation, the necessity of leaving my home immediately. All of it had been an elaborate fiction designed to get me out of his life as efficiently as possible. My son had committed what amounted to elder abuse, using deception and manipulation to force his mother into homelessness. And he'd done it with such casual cruelty, such complete disregard for my feelings or welfare, that I could barely comprehend the level of betrayal involved. I tried calling Blake immediately, my fingers stabbing at the numbers with desperate urgency. The call went straight to voicemail, that polished professional greeting he used for business contacts. I tried again, 5 minutes later. Voicemail. Again at 7 a.m. Voicemail. By the third attempt, I realized he was deliberately ignoring my calls. My son, who claimed to love me, who had just convinced me to abandon my home and my independence, couldn't even be bothered to answer the phone when his traumatized mother needed to speak with him. I tried Karina's cell phone next, though I knew it was futile. She answered on the second ring, her voice sharp with irritation. Daphne? Blake told me you were all settled at that place. Why are you calling so early? Karina, I need to speak with Blake. It's urgent. He's not available right now. He's getting ready for an important client meeting, and you know how stressful his job can be. Can't this wait until this evening? The casual dismissal in her voice, the complete lack of concern for why her mother-in-law might be calling in distress, told me everything I needed to know about Karina's role in this betrayal. Karina, Blake lied to me. There was no emergency at my apartment building. No pipe burst. No evacuation. He made the whole thing up to get me to leave. Another pause, shorter this time. When Karina spoke again, her voice carried a note of something that might have been guilt, quickly covered by defensive anger. Daphne, I think you're confused. Blake explained everything to you yesterday. Sometimes when people are under stress, they don't remember things clearly. She was gaslighting me. My own daughter-in-law was trying to make me question my own sanity, rather than admit to the fraud they'd perpetrated against me. I called the apartment office, Karina. I spoke with Helen Patterson directly. There was no emergency. Blake lied to me, and you know it. I really don't have time for this conversation right now. Karina said, her voice turning ice cold. "Blake will call you when he's available. In the meantime, I suggest you focus on getting settled in your new living situation." She hung up before I could respond, leaving me listening to the dial tone and trying to process the magnitude of what had just happened. Not only had my son betrayed me, but his wife was actively participating in the cover-up, treating me like a confused old woman whose concerns weren't worth taking seriously. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time after that, staring at my reflection in the mirror above the dresser. The woman looking back at me seemed older than she had yesterday, more fragile somehow. Her hair was disheveled from a sleepless night, her eyes red-rimmed with unshed tears, her face pale with shock and exhaustion. But there was something else in that reflection, something I hadn't expected to see. Beneath the hurt and confusion, a spark of anger was beginning to kindle. Not the hot, explosive rage that burns itself out quickly, but the slow, steady fire that builds over time and burns for a very long time. Around 10 a.m., I ventured downstairs to see if Murphy had coffee available. The gas station was busier during daylight hours, with local customers stopping for gas and convenience items alongside the long-haul truckers. Murphy was behind the counter, ringing up a purchase for a woman in scrubs who looked like she was heading to or from a hospital shift. "Morning, Mrs. Russell," he said when he spotted me. "How'd you sleep?" "Not well, I'm afraid." I gestured toward the coffee station in the corner. "Would it be all right if I got a cup of coffee?" "Help yourself. First cup's on the house for overnight. Guests." As I poured coffee from the pot marked regular, Murphy finished with his customer and walked over to me. Up close, I could see the concern in his weathered face, the way his eyes studied me with the kind of attention that suggested he'd dealt with difficult family situations before. "Ma'am, can I ask you something? And you don't have to answer if you don't want to." I nodded, cradling the warm coffee cup in both hands. "Your son, when he called yesterday to arrange the room, he seemed— I don't know how to put this exactly. He seemed awfully eager to get you settled here and get back on the road. Most folks who are helping elderly relatives through housing transitions, they ask more questions about the facilities, want to see the room first, make sure everything's safe and comfortable." Murphy's observation hit closer to home than I was prepared for. Even a stranger running a truck stop had noticed that something was off about Blake's behavior. "What exactly did Blake tell you when he called?" I asked. Murphy leaned against the counter, his expression thoughtful. "He said his mother needed temporary housing while waiting for an opening at an assisted living place in Maplewood. Said you'd had some kind of housing emergency and needed somewhere safe to stay for a few days. But ma'am, if you don't mind me saying so, you don't seem like someone who belongs in assisted living. You're steady on your feet, you're mentally sharp, you're taking care of yourself just fine." The kindness in his voice, the basic human decency he was showing to a stranger, made my eyes fill with tears. Here was a man I'd known for less than 12 hours, and he was treating me with more respect and concern than my own son had shown. "Murphy, can I trust you with something?" "Yes, ma'am. I've been running this place for 23 years, and I've learned when to mind my own business and when to listen. This feels like a listening situation." So I told him about the fake emergency, about discovering Blake's lies, about the growing realization that I'd been deliberately deceived and abandoned. Murphy listened without interruption, his face growing more grim with each detail. "That's elder abuse," he said finally. "What your son did to you, lying to get you to leave your home, dumping you here without your consent. That's a crime, in most states." "I don't want to get Blake in legal trouble," I said automatically, the words coming from decades of habit, of protecting my son even when he didn't deserve protection. Murphy studied my face for a long moment. "Ma'am, with respect, your son just committed fraud against his own mother. He doesn't seem too worried about getting you in trouble." The truth of that statement settled over me like a heavy blanket. Blake had shown no concern for my welfare, my feelings, or my legal rights when he'd decided to dispose of me like an inconvenient piece of furniture. Why was I still trying to protect him from the consequences of his own actions? "What should I do?" I asked, feeling more lost and alone than I had since Frank's death 12 years earlier. "First thing, you need to decide whether you want to go back to your apartment or find somewhere else to live. But that's your choice to make, not your son's. Second thing, you might want to think about talking to someone about your legal options. Elder abuse is serious business, and there are people who can help you navigate this situation." As I stood in that gas station, holding a cup of coffee poured by a stranger who was showing me more compassion than my own family, I began to understand that the life I'd known for 68 years was over. The woman who had trusted blindly, who had put family loyalty above her own welfare, who had enabled bad behavior in the name of love, that woman had died sometime during the night. The woman taking her place was going to be much harder to manipulate, much more selective about who deserved her time and energy, and much less willing to sacrifice her own dignity for people who didn't appreciate the gift they were receiving. Blake had wanted to get rid of an inconvenient mother. What he'd actually done was create an adversary who understood exactly how little his love was worth. The rain had stopped during the night, but the storm was just beginning. After my conversation with Murphy, I spent the rest of Saturday morning sitting in the small chair by my window, watching the steady stream of travelers coming and going from the gas station below. Truckers stretching their legs, families on road trips stopping for snacks and bathroom breaks, local workers grabbing coffee before their weekend shifts. Everyone seemed to have somewhere to go, someone expecting them, a purpose that extended beyond simply surviving the next few hours. I felt invisible, forgotten, like a piece of human debris that had washed up in this truck stop and been left behind when the tide went out. Every time a car pulled into the parking lot, I found myself hoping it might be Blake, coming back to apologize, to take me home, to somehow undo the catastrophic betrayal of the night before. But as the hours passed and he didn't appear, didn't call, didn't even respond to the increasingly desperate voicemails I'd left on his phone, the reality of my situation settled over me like a heavy fog. Around noon, I decided I needed to eat something, though my appetite had disappeared entirely. I hadn't had anything since the light dinner I'd prepared in my own kitchen the evening before. A lifetime ago, it seemed now. My hands were shaky from low blood sugar and emotional exhaustion, and I knew I needed to take care of my basic physical needs even if my world was falling apart. I made my way downstairs to ask Murphy if there was anywhere nearby to get a meal. The gas station sold the usual convenience store fare, processed sandwiches, bags of chips, candy bars, but nothing that resembled real food. My nurse's training had taught me the importance of proper nutrition, especially during times of stress, and I wasn't about to start my new life by surviving on junk food. "There's a diner about half a mile down the road," Murphy told me when I asked. "Rosie's Place. Good home cooking, reasonable prices. But ma'am, if you don't mind me saying so, you look like you could use some company more than you need food right now." He was right, though I wasn't sure how to articulate the crushing loneliness that had settled over me. I'd gone from having my own home, my own routine, my own sense of purpose and place in the world, to being a displaced person with nowhere to belong and no one who cared whether I lived or died. "I'll be fine," I said, though we both knew it was a lie. "The walk will do me good." "Tell you what," Murphy said, glancing at the clock on the wall. "My wife Jade usually brings me lunch around this time on Saturdays. Why don't you wait a few minutes and let her drive you to Rosie's? She'd enjoy the company, and it's not safe for someone your age to be walking on the shoulder of Highway 12. Before I could protest, a battered pickup truck pulled into the parking lot, and a woman about my age climbed out of the driver's seat. She was small and compact, with graying brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and wearing jeans and a flannel shirt that had seen better days. But her face was kind, with laugh lines around her eyes and the sort of warm smile that made You feel welcomed before she even spoke. That's Jade now, Murphy said, waving her toward the door. Jade, honey, come meet Mrs. Russell. She's staying in room 3 for a few days. Jade Russell, no relation to me despite the shared surname, entered the gas station with the confident stride of someone comfortable in her own skin. She looked at me with the same assessing kindness I'd seen in Murphy's eyes, taking in my rumpled appearance and obvious distress without making me feel judged or pitied. Pleased to meet you, Mrs. Russell, she said, extending a work-roughened hand. Are you traveling through, or are you staying in the area for a while? It was a simple question, but it opened the floodgates of everything I'd been holding back since discovering Blake's betrayal. I found myself telling this stranger the entire story. The fake emergency, the lies about Sunset Gardens, the realization that my son had essentially kidnapped me and deposited me at a truck stop because I'd become inconvenient to his lifestyle. Jade listened without interruption, her expression growing more troubled with each detail. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, exchanging a meaningful look with Murphy that suggested they'd encountered similar situations before. Honey, she said finally, what your son did to you isn't just wrong, it's criminal. And I'll bet you anything this isn't the first time he's manipulated you to get what he wants. The observation hit closer to home than I was comfortable admitting. How many times over the years had Blake presented me with situations where I felt I had no choice but to comply with his requests? How many times had he used emotional manipulation or carefully constructed crises to get me to give him money, time, or support that I couldn't really afford? I brought Murphy's lunch, Jade continued, but there's plenty for 3 people. Why don't you come sit with us in the back room and have something to eat? You look like you haven't had a proper meal in days. The kindness in her voice, the simple human decency of sharing food with a stranger in need, made my eyes fill with tears again. Here were people I'd known for less than 24 hours, and they were treating me with more care and consideration than my own family had shown in years. The back room of Murphy's Gas and Go turned out to be a small but comfortable space with a kitchenette, a round table with 4 chairs, and walls covered with family photographs spanning decades. Pictures of Murphy and Jade's wedding, their 3 grown offspring at various stages of life, grandkids in Little League uniforms and graduation caps, family gatherings where everyone actually looked happy to be together. We live about 10 miles from here, Jade explained as she unpacked containers of homemade fried chicken, mashed potatoes, and green beans from a cooler bag. But Murphy spends so much time at the station that we practically live here too. I bring him lunch every Saturday so we can have a few minutes together during his busy day. The food was delicious, real, homemade cooking that reminded me of the meals my mother used to prepare when I was young. As we ate, Jade and Murphy told me about their life together, their family, their 40-year marriage that had weathered its share of storms, but had emerged stronger each time. Our oldest boy went through a difficult period in his 20s, Jade said, refilling my coffee cup without being asked. Drinking, bad decisions, treating us terribly when we tried to help. For about 5 years, we barely spoke because he blamed us for everything wrong in his life. What changed? I asked, genuinely curious about how families recovered from such serious breaks. We stopped enabling him, Murphy said simply. Stopped giving him money, stopped making excuses for his behavior, stopped pretending that love meant accepting abuse. It was the hardest thing we'd ever done, but it was the only way to save both him and our relationship with him. Did it work? Eventually, Jade nodded. It took him hitting rock bottom and realizing that his actions had consequences before he was ready to take responsibility for his life. But once he did, once he started making genuine changes instead of just promising to do better, we were able to rebuild our relationship on a foundation of mutual respect instead of obligation and guilt. Their story gave me something I hadn't had since Blake's abandonment: hope. Not hope that my son would suddenly develop a conscience and come rescue me from this situation, but hope that I could create a different kind of life for myself, One based on my own choices rather than other people's expectations. "The question is," Murphy said, looking at me seriously, "what do you want to do now? You can't stay in that room indefinitely, and you shouldn't have to." "I don't know," I admitted. "I keep thinking Blake will call, will realize what he's done, and try to make it right. But even if he does, I'm not sure I could ever trust him again." "Trust is like a fine piece of china," Jade said quietly. "Once it's broken, you can glue it back together, but it's never quite the same. It's always going to have those cracks, those weak spots where it broke before." As the afternoon wore on, I found myself relaxing for the first time since Blake had appeared at my door the night before. Murphy and Jade didn't treat me like a burden or an inconvenience. They didn't rush me through my story or offer empty platitudes about family relationships working themselves out. They simply listened, shared their own experiences, and made it clear that I was welcome in their space for as long as I needed to be there. "You know what?" Jade said as we were cleaning up the lunch dishes. "Why don't you come home with me for the evening? Murphy's got to work until 11, and I hate the thought of you sitting alone in that room upstairs, brooding about things you can't control." I couldn't impose. I started to protest, but she waved me off. "It's not imposing if it's offered freely. Besides, I could use the company. Our house gets too quiet on Saturday evenings, and I've got a pot roast in the slow cooker that's too big for just Murphy and me." As I gathered my purse and followed Jade out to her pickup truck, I marveled at how different this felt from every interaction I'd had with Blake and Karina over the past several years. These people weren't helping me because they felt obligated to, or because they wanted something from me, or because they were trying to manage an inconvenient situation. They were helping me because they recognized a fellow human being in distress and felt moved to act with kindness. For the first time since Frank's death, I felt like I mattered to someone. Not as a source of money or free babysitting or emotional labor, but as a person worthy of care and consideration simply because I existed. The contrast between this genuine warmth and the cold calculation Blake had shown when abandoning me was so stark, it took my breath away. I was beginning to understand that real family wasn't about shared DNA or legal obligations. Real family was about people choosing to show up for each other, again and again, without keeping score. Blake had taught me what false family looked like. Jade and Murphy were showing me what the real thing could be. Jade and Murphy's house was a modest ranch-style home set back from the road on 5 acres of gently rolling land. The driveway was gravel, lined with mature oak trees that created a canopy of green overhead, and the front porch was decorated with hanging baskets of flowers that spoke of someone who took pride in creating beauty in simple ways. "It's not fancy," Jade said as we pulled up to the house. "But it's been home for 32 years. We bought it when the kids were small and never saw any reason to leave." The interior was warm and welcoming, with worn but comfortable furniture, family photographs covering every available surface, and the kind of lived-in feeling that comes from decades of genuine happiness. The pot roast Jade had mentioned filled the house with rich, savory aromas that reminded me of Sunday dinners from my childhood. "Sit down and make yourself comfortable," Jade said, gesturing toward a well-worn recliner that had obviously been Murphy's favorite chair for years. "I'll get us some tea and we can talk properly." As I settled into the chair, I found myself looking at the family photographs scattered throughout the living room. Unlike the carefully staged professional portraits that dominated Blake and Karina's house, these were candid moments captured over the years. Graduation parties, birthday celebrations, holiday gatherings where people actually looked like they enjoyed each other's company. "Those are our kids," Jade said, returning with 2 steaming mugs of tea. "Preston, our oldest, lives about 20 miles from here with his wife and 2 boys. Eliza, our middle one, is a teacher in the county seat, and our youngest, Asher, just finished his residency and is working as a doctor at the regional medical center." They all stayed close to home, I observed, thinking about how Blake had moved 3 hours away shortly after college and rarely visited unless he needed something. "They chose to stay close," Jade corrected gently. We never pressured them one way or the other. We figured if we'd raised them right and treated them well, they'd want to maintain relationships with us. If we hadn't, then no amount of guilt or obligation would create genuine love. The distinction she was drawing became clearer as she told me more about her family's dynamics. Her adult offspring called regularly, not because they felt they had to, but because they genuinely enjoyed talking to their parents. They included Jade and Murphy in their lives naturally, seeking advice when they needed it and offering help when their parents faced challenges. When Murphy had his heart attack 3 years ago, Jade said, all 3 kids rearranged their schedules to take turns staying with us during his recovery. Not because we asked them to, but because they wanted to. That's when you know you've done something right as a parent. When your grown offspring choose to show up for you without being asked. The contrast to my own situation was so stark, it was painful. When I'd needed Blake's help over the years, after Frank's death, during my own minor health scares during the financial struggles that followed my retirement, I'd always had to ask. And even then, his assistance had come with subtle signs of resentment, as if my needs were impositions on his busy life. Tell me about your relationship with Blake before this happened, Jade said, settling into the chair across from me. Were there other times when he made you feel like a burden? It was a perceptive question, and it forced me to examine patterns I'd been ignoring for years. As I thought back over my interactions with Blake during the past decade, I began to see a troubling consistency in his behavior. There was the time he'd convinced me to cash out my small retirement account to help him and Karina buy their house, promising to pay me back within 2 years. 7 years later, the debt had never been mentioned again, and any time I'd tried to bring it up, Blake had deflected the conversation by talking about his mortgage payments and how tight money was for young families. There was the period when he'd asked me to babysit Ashley and Connor every weekend for 2 years while he and Karina pursued their social lives, but had stopped including me in family holidays because Karina felt it was important to establish their own traditions. I'd provided free childcare when convenient, but wasn't welcome at family celebrations. There was the Christmas when I'd spent my grocery money on expensive gifts for the grandkids, only to have Blake return everything to the store without telling me because Karina thought the presents were inappropriate, too educational for Ashley, too young for Connor, not matching their carefully curated aesthetic preferences. He's been training you for years, Jade said quietly when I finished recounting these incidents. Teaching you that your role in his life is to give whatever he needs whenever he needs it, without expecting anything in return. What happened yesterday wasn't out of character for Blake. It was the logical conclusion of a pattern that's been developing for a long time. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I hadn't been blind to my son's selfishness. I'd been systematically conditioned to accept it. Every time I'd accommodated his unreasonable demands, every time I'd made excuses for his poor treatment, every time I'd prioritized his comfort over my own dignity, I'd been teaching him that he could get away with more. But surely not all adult offspring are like this, I said, thinking about the elderly people I'd known over the years who seemed to have warm, reciprocal relationships with their families. Of course not, Jade agreed. But you'd be surprised how common your situation is becoming. Murphy and I see it all the time at the gas station. Elderly people dumped at truck stops, rest areas, bus stations by families who've decided they're inconvenient. Sometimes it's temporary, like your situation. Sometimes it's permanent abandonment. She got up and returned with a photo album, flipping through pages until she found what she was looking for. "This is Dorothy Chen," she said, pointing to a picture of a small, elderly Asian woman standing next to Murphy in front of the gas station. Her daughter-in-law brought her here 6 months ago, claiming she was taking Dorothy to visit relatives in another state. Left her in room 2 with a suitcase and $50, said she'd be back in a few days to pick her up. What happened? To her? She's still here. Turns out the daughter-in-law had cleaned out Dorothy's bank accounts and sold her house. Dorothy had nowhere to go and no money to get there. She's been working part-time in the gas station, helping Murphy with inventory, and bookkeeping in exchange for room and board. Jade turned more pages, showing me pictures of other elderly people who'd found themselves in similar situations. This is Garrett Hill. His son convinced him to sign over power of attorney, then had him declared incompetent and stole his life savings. This is Alexa Coleman. Her daughter moved her into assisted living against her will, then sold all her possessions and pocketed the money. The faces looking back at me from those photographs told stories of betrayal, abandonment, and systematic abuse by the very people who were supposed to love and protect them. I wasn't alone in my experience, wasn't uniquely unlucky or particularly foolish. I was part of a growing epidemic of elder abuse that was being perpetrated by adult offspring who viewed their aging parents as inconvenient burdens rather than family members deserving of respect. How do these people survive? I asked, overwhelmed by the scope of the problem. Some don't, Jade said bluntly. Some give up, retreat into depression and despair, let their health deteriorate until they die of what's essentially a broken heart. But others fight back. They rebuild their lives, create new families based on choice rather than blood, find ways to thrive despite the betrayal. She showed me more pictures, the same elderly people, but taken months later. Dorothy Chen smiling, behind the counter at Murphy's, clearly proud of her work and her independence. Garrett Hill at a community center, teaching computer skills to other seniors. Alexa Coleman at what appeared to be a graduation ceremony, wearing academic regalia. Dorothy discovered she has a real talent for business management, Jade explained. She's helping Murphy modernize his inventory systems and has increased profits by 20%. Garrett started a support group for elder abuse survivors that now has 37 members. Alexa went back to school at 69 and just earned her bachelor's degree in social work. They all reinvented themselves. They all chose to reinvent themselves, Jade corrected. That's the key difference. They could have stayed stuck in victim mode, waiting for their families to develop consciences and come rescue them. Instead, they decided to take control of their own lives and build something better. As evening fell and Murphy arrived home from work, I found myself thinking about the choice Jade had described. I could continue waiting for Blake to realize what he'd done and try to make amends. I could accept the victim role he'd assigned me and spend my remaining years warehoused in whatever institution he deemed appropriate. I could let his betrayal define the rest of my life. Or I could fight back. Over dinner, Murphy and Jade told me more about the informal network they'd developed to help elderly people who'd been abandoned or abused by their families. They connected. People with legal resources helped them navigate social services, provided temporary housing and emotional support, while survivors figured out their next steps. The hardest part for most people, Murphy explained, is accepting that their family relationships were built on lies. Once you get past that denial and start seeing the situation clearly, you can begin making decisions based on what's best for you, rather than what's convenient for people who've already shown they don't care about your welfare. What would fighting back look like in my situation? I asked. Jade and Murphy exchanged a meaningful glance before Jade answered. That depends on what you want to accomplish. Do you want to punish Blake for what he's done? Do you want to protect yourself from future manipulation? Do you want to help other people avoid similar situations? Do you want to build a new life that reflects your values rather than his expectations? All of the above, I said, without hesitation. Then, we'll help you figure out how to do that, Murphy said simply. Starting tomorrow, if you're ready. As I prepared for bed in their guest room that night, surrounded by the warmth and safety of genuine hospitality, I realized that Blake's betrayal had inadvertently given me something I'd been missing for years: clarity about what real family relationships were supposed to look like. He'd meant to dispose of an inconvenient mother. Instead, he'd freed me from the obligation to continue enabling his selfishness. Now it was time to show him what that freedom looked like. I woke up Sunday morning in Jade and Murphy's guest room feeling more rested than I had in months. The bed was comfortable, The house was quiet, except for the gentle sounds of birds outside, the window, and for the first time since Frank's death, I felt truly safe. Not just physically safe, but emotionally protected by people who had no ulterior motives for their kindness. Jade had left a fresh towel and washcloth on the dresser, along with a note saying breakfast would be ready whenever I was. The simple consideration of that gesture, thinking ahead to my comfort without being asked, highlighted just how long it had been since anyone in my biological family had shown me such basic courtesy. Over coffee and homemade pancakes, Murphy and Jade outlined their plan for helping me navigate the next steps. They knew a lawyer who specialized in elder law and family abuse cases, someone who could help me understand my legal options. They had connections with housing advocates who could help me find appropriate living arrangements. Most importantly, they had experience helping other elderly abuse survivors reclaim their independence and dignity. The first thing we need to do, Jade said, is document everything that happened. Write down every conversation you remember with Blake, every lie he told, every manipulation he used. If you decide to pursue legal action, you'll need a clear record of his behavior. Before I could respond, my phone rang. Blake's name appeared on the screen, and my heart immediately started racing. Despite everything I'd learned about his character, despite the magnitude of his betrayal, some part of me still hoped he was calling to apologize, to explain that this had all been a terrible misunderstanding. "Answer it," Murphy said, "but put it on speaker so we can hear what he says. People like Blake often reveal their true motivations when they think they're in control of the conversation." I answered the call with shaking hands. "Hello, Blake? Mom. Finally." His voice carried irritation rather than concern, as if I'd been avoiding his calls rather than desperately trying to reach him. "I've been trying to call you back. Your phone's been going straight to voicemail." It was a lie, of course. I'd left my phone on continuously, checking it every few minutes for any sign that he cared enough to contact me. But Blake had always been skilled at rewriting history to suit his needs. "I've been calling you since yesterday morning," I said. "You haven't answered once. I told you I was busy with work stuff. Look, I'm calling because there's been a development with the Sunset Garden situation. Here it comes," I thought. Another lie, another manipulation designed to keep me compliant and cooperative. What kind of development? Well, it turns out the room situation is more complicated than they initially explained. The administrator called this morning and said it's going to be at least 2 weeks before they have appropriate accommodations available, maybe longer. Murphy and Jade exchanged a meaningful glance across the kitchen table. Blake was extending his timeline, moving the goalposts to keep me trapped in limbo at the truck stop indefinitely. "Blake, I need to tell you something. I called my apartment building yesterday morning. There was no pipe burst, no emergency evacuation. You lied to me about everything." The silence that followed lasted long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. When Blake finally spoke, his voice had changed completely. Gone was any pretense of concern or affection, replaced by cold calculation. "Mom, I think you're confused about what happened. Sometimes when people are under stress, they don't remember conversations clearly. The building management probably didn't want to discuss the details with you directly because of liability issues. He was gaslighting me, trying to make me question my own sanity and memory rather than admit to his deception. It was exactly what Karina had done when I'd called her, and I realized this was a strategy they'd discussed and planned together. I spoke directly with Helen Patterson," I said firmly. "She confirmed that no emergency occurred. Blake, why did you lie to me? Why did you force me to leave my home?" Another pause, and when he spoke again, his mask had slipped entirely. The voice that answered was colder and more calculating than I'd ever heard from my son. "Look, Mom, we need to be realistic about your situation. You're 68 years old, you're living alone in that tiny apartment, you have no social life and no real purpose. Sooner or later, you're going to have some kind of health crisis or emergency. And then what? Karina and I are supposed to drop everything and manage your care? There it was. The truth I'd been too naive to see. Blake hadn't arranged for my care because he was concerned about my welfare. He'd had me kidnapped and abandoned because he was preemptively eliminating an inconvenience from his life. Blake, I'm perfectly healthy. I don't need managed care. Yet. You don't need it yet. But what happens when you do? What happens when you fall and break a hip, or have a stroke, or develop dementia? Karina and I have our own lives, our own responsibilities. We can't be expected to sacrifice our careers and our youngsters' futures to take care of an elderly parent who should have planned better for her own old age. The cruelty in his words took my breath away. This was how my son really saw me, not as his mother who had sacrificed everything to give him opportunities, but as a future liability that needed to be managed and contained before it could impact his comfortable lifestyle. Blake, I never asked you to sacrifice anything for me. I never even asked you to check on me more than you wanted to. No, but you would have. Eventually, you would have expected us to be there for you the way you think you were there for me. And frankly, Mom, the guilt trips and emotional manipulation were already starting. All those comments about feeling lonely, about wishing we visited more, about missing the grandkids, that's just the beginning of the demands that were coming. I looked at Jade and Murphy, who were listening to this conversation with expressions of horrified disbelief. Blake was describing basic human needs for connection and family relationships as manipulation tactics. He was reframing my natural desire to be included in my own family as unreasonable demands. So you decided to have me committed to assisted living against my will? I decided to find you appropriate housing that matches your current life stage, where you'll have social opportunities and professional care available if you need it. Sunset Gardens is a nice place, Mom. You'll be much happier there than sitting alone in that depressing apartment feeling sorry for yourself. And if I refuse to go to Sunset Gardens? Blake's laugh was harsh and bitter. With what money? Mom, let's be honest about your financial situation. You're living on Social Security and a tiny pension. You can't afford to be picky about housing. Options. But that's where Blake had made a crucial miscalculation. He'd never bothered to learn the details of my financial situation because he'd assumed that a retired nurse would naturally be poor and dependent. He didn't know about the life insurance policy Frank had carried, or the investments we'd made during our marriage, or the fact that I'd been far more careful with money than he'd ever realized. Blake, what you did to me was elder abuse. It was kidnapping and fraud. I could have you arrested. Go ahead and try, he said, his voice turning vicious. Who's going to believe you? A confused elderly woman living in a truck stop, making wild accusations against her successful son who was just trying to help her? Good luck with that. The mask was completely off now. This was the real Blake, manipulative, calculating, utterly lacking in empathy or remorse. The son I'd thought I'd raised, the man I'd believed still existed underneath his selfishness, was a fiction I'd created to avoid facing the truth about who he'd become. Is Karina part of this plan? I asked. Karina's the one who suggested we needed to be proactive about your living situation, Blake said with obvious pride. She pointed out that waiting until you had a crisis would be much more disruptive to our lives than handling the transition now, while we could still control the circumstances. So Karina hadn't just participated in my abandonment. She'd been the mastermind behind it. My daughter-in-law had looked at her elderly mother-in-law and seen nothing but a potential inconvenience that needed to be eliminated before it could affect her comfortable suburban lifestyle. Mom, here's what's going to happen, Blake continued, in a tone that brooked no argument. You're going to stay at that motel until Sunset Gardens has space available. When they call, you're going to move in quietly and cooperatively. You're going to stop making accusations and causing drama. And if you're a good resident and don't make trouble, Karina and I might visit occasionally. The conditional nature of his affection was the final insult. Even now, Even after revealing his complete lack of love or respect for me, Blake was trying to use the promise of future visits as leverage to ensure my compliance. And if I refuse, then you'll find out exactly how alone in the world you really are. Do you think anyone else is going to take in a homeless 68-year-old woman with no money and a reputation for making false accusations against her own family? This is the best deal you're going to get, Mom. I'd suggest you take it. He hung up before I could respond, leaving me staring at my phone in shock. The conversation had stripped away every illusion I'd maintained about my relationship with Blake and Karina. They didn't love me, had never loved me in any meaningful sense. They saw me as an obligation at best, a liability at worst, and a problem that needed to be solved efficiently and permanently. Jade reached across the table and took my hand. Honey, I'm so sorry you had to hear him say those things, but I'm also glad you heard them, because now you know exactly what you're dealing with. He's counting on you being too shocked and hurt to fight back, Murphy added. People like Blake rely on their victims' love and loyalty to keep them from facing consequences. They assume that parental instincts will override self-preservation. But he miscalculated, I said, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice, because he just gave me something more valuable than an apology. What's that? Jade asked. Clarity. Complete, perfect clarity about who he really is and what he really thinks of me. And now I know exactly how to respond. For the first time, since this nightmare began, I felt truly free. Free from the burden of hoping Blake would become a better person. Free from the obligation to protect him from the consequences of his own actions. Free from the need to maintain a relationship that existed only in my imagination. Blake wanted to play hardball? He was about to discover that his supposedly helpless mother had learned a thing or two about strategy over the years. And unlike him, I actually had both the resources and the moral authority to win this fight. After Blake's phone call revealed the full extent of his callous manipulation, I sat in Jade and Murphy's kitchen feeling something I hadn't experienced in years. A cold, clear fury that burned away decades of self-doubt and misplaced loyalty. For the first time since Frank's death, I knew exactly who I was and what I needed to do. I want to call that lawyer you mentioned, I told Murphy. Today, if possible. Her name is Patricia Stone, he said, already reaching for his phone. She's handled cases like yours before, and she doesn't mess around when it comes to elder abuse. Let me see if she can meet with us this afternoon. While Murphy made the call, Jade helped me organize my thoughts and memories into a coherent timeline of Blake's manipulation. We wrote down every incident I could remember, every lie he'd told, every time he'd used emotional blackmail to get what he wanted. The pattern that emerged was damning. Years of systematic psychological abuse designed to keep me compliant and financially generous. Patricia Stone agreed to meet with us at her office in town that afternoon. She was a woman, in her 50s with steel gray hair and the kind of direct gaze that suggested she'd seen every variety of human cruelty and wasn't easily shocked. Her office walls were covered with certificates and awards recognizing her work in elder law and victim advocacy. Mrs. Russell, she said after I'd finished explaining my situation, what your son did to you constitutes criminal elder abuse under state law. The deception, the false imprisonment, the financial manipulation, each of these is a felony offense. I don't necessarily want to send Blake to prison, I said, though I wasn't entirely sure that was true anymore. I just want to protect myself and make sure he can't do this to me again. Patricia leaned back in her chair, studying me carefully. Mrs. Russell, can I ask you something? If a stranger had done to you what your son did, lied to you, kidnapped you, abandoned you at a truck stop, would you hesitate to press charges? The question hit home immediately. Of course I wouldn't hesitate if a stranger had committed these crimes against me. The only reason I was considering protecting Blake was the lingering belief that family loyalty somehow trumped my own safety and dignity. No, I admitted. I wouldn't hesitate. Then why should Blake get special treatment? Because he shares your DNA? Because you changed his diapers 40 years ago? Mrs. Russell, the very fact that he's your son makes his betrayal worse, not better. He had a moral and legal obligation to protect you, and instead he deliberately harmed you for his own convenience. Patricia was right, and I knew it. Blake had forfeited any claim to my protection or consideration when he decided to treat me like an inconvenient piece of property to be disposed of efficiently. What are my options? I asked. Legally, we can pursue both criminal charges and civil remedies. The criminal case would be handled by the district attorney's office, and given the evidence you've described, I believe they'd be very interested in prosecuting. The civil case would allow us to seek monetary damages for the harm Blake has caused you. What kind of damages? Emotional distress, financial losses from being forced to abandon your housing, punitive damages to discourage similar behavior in the future. Depending on Blake's assets and income, we could be talking about a substantial recovery. But as Patricia outlined my legal options, I realized that money wasn't what I wanted most. What I wanted was something more fundamental, the power to control my own life and the assurance that Blake would never again be able to manipulate or abuse me. Patricia, what would happen if I decided not to pursue legal action against Blake directly, but instead focused on protecting myself from future manipulation? She raised an eyebrow. What did you have in mind? I want to change my will. I want to make sure that none of my assets ever go to Blake or his family. And I want to do it in a way that sends a clear message about why I'm making this decision. Patricia smiled for the first time since our meeting began. Now that's something I can definitely help you with. And given what you've told me about Blake's assumptions regarding your financial situation, I suspect he's going to be in for quite a surprise. Over the next 2 hours, Patricia and I worked on drafting documents that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of my family relationships. First, we created a detailed affidavit documenting Blake's abuse and abandonment, complete with dates, times, and witness statements from Murphy and Jade. This would serve as both a legal record and an explanation for my subsequent decisions. Next, we began work on a comprehensive new will that would ensure my assets went to people who had shown me genuine love and respect, rather than to those who felt entitled to my money simply because of shared genetics. The Mendoza family, Murphy, Jade, and their children, would receive the bulk of my estate in recognition of their kindness during my darkest hour. But the will was more than just a financial document. It was a statement of values. I included detailed explanations for each bequest, making it clear that I was rewarding character and compassion rather than blood relationships. Anyone who read the document would understand exactly why Blake had been disinherited and what he could have done differently to maintain his place in my life. There's one more thing I want to do, I told Patricia as we were finishing up. I want to establish a trust fund to help other elderly people who've been abandoned or abused by their families. Something that would provide emergency housing, legal assistance, and emotional support for people in situations like mine. That's a beautiful idea, Patricia said. We can structure it as a charitable trust with very specific guidelines about who qualifies for assistance. You could even name it something that honors your experience. The Frank and Daphne Russell Foundation for Elder Abuse Survivors, perhaps. The idea of turning my pain into a source of help for others felt like the most meaningful thing I could do with the resources Frank and I had accumulated over our lifetime together. Blake had wanted to warehouse me in an institution to avoid dealing with the inconvenience of an aging mother. Instead, his betrayal was going to fund a network of support for other elderly people facing similar abandonment. As we finalized the documents, I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders that I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying. For years, I'd structured my life around Blake's needs and expectations, always worried about whether I was being too demanding or too needy, always afraid that asking for basic respect or consideration would somehow damage our relationship. Now, I understood that there had never been a real relationship to damage. Blake had viewed me as a resource to be exploited and then discarded when I was no longer useful. The loving son I'd believed in had been a fiction I'd created to avoid facing the truth about who he really was. "Mrs. Russell," Patricia said as we prepared to leave her office, "I want you to understand something important. What you're doing today isn't revenge against Blake. It's justice. You're holding him accountable for his actions and ensuring that your life's work goes to people who will honor your memory, rather than people who've dishonored your trust." That evening, back at Murphy and Jade's house, I called my bank and my investment advisor to begin the process of implementing my new financial arrangements. The numbers I shared with them clearly surprised Patricia. Like Blake, most people had assumed that a retired nurse would have limited assets. But Frank and I had been careful savers and wise investors. We'd lived below our means for decades, putting money aside for retirement and emergencies. The life insurance policy Frank had carried was substantial, and I'd invested the proceeds conservatively but effectively. Between my savings, investments, and the modest inheritance I'd received when my parents passed away, my estate was worth considerably more than Blake had ever imagined. "How much are we talking about?" Jade asked quietly. "Enough to ensure that Blake and Karina will regret their decision to abandon me for the rest of their lives," I said, "and enough to help dozens of other elderly people avoid the kind of abuse I've experienced." As I prepared for bed that night, I thought about the woman I'd been just 3 days earlier. She'd been naive, trusting, willing to sacrifice her own dignity and well-being to maintain relationships with people who didn't value her. She'd believed that love meant endless giving without expectation of return, that family loyalty required accepting any treatment family members chose to dish out. That woman was gone, and I didn't mourn her passing. In her place was someone harder and wiser, someone who understood that real love required mutual respect and that some bridges deserved to be burned when the people on the other side proved themselves unworthy of crossing. Blake had wanted to dispose of an inconvenient mother. Instead, he'd created an adversary who understood exactly how much power she actually held. Tomorrow, I would begin showing him what that power looked like when wielded by someone who no longer cared about protecting people who had never protected her. The rain that had started the night Blake abandoned me had finally stopped, but the storm I was about to unleash on his carefully constructed life was just beginning. 2 weeks after Patricia Stone and I had finished drafting my new will and establishing the Elder Abuse Survivor Trust, Blake called me again. This time, his voice carried a note of desperation that he was trying hard to mask with his usual manipulative charm. "Mom? Good news," he said, though nothing in his tone suggested he felt particularly positive about whatever he was calling to share. "Sunset Gardens finally has a room available. We can get you moved in this weekend if you're ready." I was sitting in Murphy and Jade's living room, helping Jade sort through donations for a church clothing drive, when the call came through. Over the past 2 weeks, I'd settled into a comfortable routine with them, helping around the house, working part-time at the gas station doing bookkeeping, gradually rebuilding my sense of purpose and self-worth. For the first time in years, I felt useful and appreciated rather than merely tolerated. "Actually, Blake, I've made other arrangements," I said calmly. The silence that followed was telling. Blake had clearly expected me to be grateful for this opportunity, eager to escape the truck stop motel and move into what he considered appropriate housing for an elderly woman of limited means. "What kind of other arrangements?" he asked, his voice sharpening with suspicion. "I've decided not to go to Sunset Gardens after all. I'm staying here in the area where I've found people who actually care about my welfare." "Mom, that's ridiculous. You can't live in a motel room indefinitely. And those people you're talking about, they're strangers. They don't have any real obligation to you." The irony of Blake lecturing me about obligation was almost laughable. The man who had abandoned his mother at a gas station was concerned that strangers might not feel sufficiently responsible for my well-being. "You're right, Blake. They don't have any obligation to me. That's what makes their kindness genuine rather than forced. Look, I know you're upset about how things have gone, but you're not thinking clearly. You need professional care, structured activities, medical supervision. Sunset Gardens can provide all of that. I could hear Karina's voice in the background, sharp and impatient as always. She was clearly growing frustrated with Blake's inability to close this deal efficiently. Blake, I need to tell you something important. I've been consulting with a lawyer about what you did to me, and I've learned some interesting things about elder abuse laws. Another silence, longer this time. When Blake spoke again, his voice had changed completely. Gone was the patronizing patience, replaced by something that sounded almost like fear. What are you talking about? I haven't abused you. I've been trying to help you find appropriate housing. By lying to me about an emergency, kidnapping me from my home and abandoning me at a truck stop? Blake, what you did to me is a felony under state law. Multiple felonies, actually. I could hear Karina's voice more clearly now, demanding to know what I was saying. Blake was obviously struggling to maintain control of a conversation that was spiraling away from his carefully planned script. Mom, you're being paranoid. Nobody's going to believe that I kidnapped you. I was helping you transition to a safer living situation. Actually, I have witnesses to everything that happened. Murphy and Jade heard your phone calls, saw how you behaved when you dropped me off. And I have recordings of our recent conversations where you admitted that this was all planned in advance to prevent me from becoming an inconvenience to your lifestyle. This was a slight exaggeration. I hadn't actually recorded our phone calls. But Blake's sharp intake of breath suggested that he wasn't entirely sure what evidence I might have gathered. What do you want? He asked finally, dropping all pretense of concern for my welfare. I want you to understand that actions have consequences, Blake. For 36 years, I protected you from the results of your poor choices. I gave you money you never repaid, time you never appreciated, and love you never returned. I enabled your selfishness by always putting your needs ahead of my own dignity. Mom, I'm not finished. You made a calculation when you decided to abandon me. You assumed I was powerless, that I had no resources or options, that I would have no choice but to accept whatever treatment you chose to give me. You were wrong on all counts. The conversation was interrupted by a call-waiting beep. Blake's number showed up again immediately, suggesting he'd hung up and called back, probably after a heated discussion with Karina about damage control strategies. Mom, let's be reasonable about this, he said when I answered. If you're concerned about legal issues, we can work something out. Maybe we moved too fast with the housing transition. Maybe we should have consulted you more thoroughly. His sudden willingness to negotiate told me everything I needed to know about how seriously he was taking my threats. Blake was a successful businessman who understood liability and risk management. If he was backtracking this quickly, it meant his lawyer had explained exactly how much trouble he could be facing. It's too late for reasonable, Blake. You had 36 years to treat me with basic human decency, and you chose to treat me like an inconvenience instead. The time for working things out ended when you drove away from Murphy's Gas and Go without looking back. What are you going to do? For the first time in our entire relationship, Blake was asking me what I wanted instead of telling me what I should accept. The shift in power dynamics was intoxicating. I'm going to live my life according to my own values instead of your expectations. I'm going to surround myself with people who appreciate my contributions rather than people who take them for granted. And I'm going to make sure that my resources go to causes and people who deserve them. What does that mean? It means I've changed my will, Blake. Every penny that you and Karina were counting on inheriting is going to people who've shown me genuine kindness and respect. The bulk of my estate will go to Murphy and Jade's family, who took in a stranger without asking for anything in return. The rest will fund a charitable trust to help other elderly people who've been abandoned by their families. The explosion that followed was everything I'd expected, and more. Blake's carefully controlled facade cracked completely, revealing the entitled, "Selfish Man Who'd Been Hiding Underneath All Along." "You can't do that," he shouted. "That money belongs to our family. You can't just give away my inheritance to strangers." "It's not your inheritance, Blake. It's my money, earned through my work and Frank's, saved through our sacrifices and careful planning. You have no claim to it beyond the assumption that being my biological son entitles you to profit from my death. We have expenses. Karina's pregnant again, the kids need college funds, we have a mortgage and car payments, and none of that is my responsibility. You're adults with good jobs and expensive tastes. If you need more money, earn it yourself instead of counting on your elderly mother to subsidize your lifestyle." Karina had clearly taken the phone away from Blake at this point because the voice that responded was hers, sharp with fury and panic. "Daphne, you're being vindictive and cruel. Blake made a mistake, but this is an insane overreaction. You're punishing your entire family because you're hurt and angry." "I'm not punishing anyone, Karina. I'm simply directing my resources toward people who've earned them through their character and actions. If you wanted to be included in my will, you should have considered treating me like family instead of like an inconvenience. Those people you're giving money to, they're just being nice to you because they know you have money. At least Blake and I are honest about our financial needs." The accusation revealed more about Karina's mindset than mine. She literally couldn't conceive of people being kind without ulterior motives because kindness without calculation was foreign to her nature. "Actually, Karina, Murphy and Jade don't know about my financial situation. They've been helping me because they're genuinely good people who believe in taking care of others. The fact that you can't understand that says everything about who you are and nothing about who they are." The call devolved into threats and bargaining attempts from that point. Blake got back on the phone to promise that they would visit more, often include me in family gatherings, treat me with the respect I deserved, if only I would reconsider my financial decisions. But it was too late for promises. I'd heard Blake's real feelings during our previous conversation, had seen exactly how little I meant to him when he thought he had all the power. These sudden declarations of love and family devotion were transparently manipulative, offered, only because he'd learned that his inheritance was at stake. "Blake," I said finally, "if you'd shown me 1/10 of this attention and concern before you found out about my will, we might have had a different conversation. But you didn't, because you never cared about me as a person. You only care about me as a source of money, and now that source has dried up." I hung up on them for the first time in my life, feeling a rush of liberation that was almost overwhelming. For decades, I'd been the one trying to maintain our relationship, making excuses for their poor treatment, accepting whatever scraps of attention they were willing to throw my way. Now the tables had turned completely. Blake and Karina needed something from me, and I had the power to give it or withhold it based on my own judgment of their worthiness. They had failed that judgment spectacularly, and they were about to discover that some consequences couldn't be charmed or manipulated away. The phone rang again immediately, but I didn't answer. Blake and Karina could spend the rest of their lives calling me, begging me, promising to change, but the trust they'd shattered couldn't be repaired with words. They'd taught me that family meant nothing to them. Now I was going to teach them what that lesson looked like when it worked in reverse. 6 months after Blake's desperate phone calls, I stood in the kitchen of my new home, a charming cottage on Murphy and Jade's property that we'd renovated together using a portion of my savings. The house had 2 bedrooms, a cozy living room with a stone fireplace, and large windows that looked out over the rolling countryside where I'd found peace and purpose again. The cottage represented everything Blake had tried to steal from me. Independence, dignity, the right to make my own choices about how and where to live. Instead of being warehoused in an institution against my will, I was thriving in a home I'd helped design, surrounded by people who valued my contributions and respected my autonomy. "Daphne, the lawyer's here," Jade called from the front porch, where she'd been waiting for Patricia Stone to arrive with the final papers for the Elder Abuse Survivor Trust we'd been establishing. Over the past 6 months, My life had transformed in ways I never could have imagined when Blake first abandoned me at Murphy's Gas and Go. The part-time bookkeeping work I'd started at the gas station had evolved into a comprehensive business management role that utilized skills I'd developed over decades of managing household finances and hospital administration. Murphy's profits had increased by 30% under my guidance, and he'd insisted on making me a partner in the business. More importantly, I'd found a sense of purpose that had been missing from my life for years. The Elder Abuse Survivor Trust was now officially operational, with a board of directors that included myself, Patricia Stone, and 3 other advocates for elderly rights. We'd already helped 12 elderly people escape abusive family situations, providing them with emergency housing, legal assistance, and the emotional support needed to rebuild their lives. The Frank and Daphne Russell Foundation for Elder Abuse Survivors is now a fully registered 501c3 charity, Patricia announced as she spread the final documents across my kitchen table. You have enough initial funding to help at least 50 people over the next 2 years, and I've already received inquiries from other potential donors who want to support this work. The foundation had become the most meaningful project of my life, transforming the pain of Blake's betrayal into a source of hope for other abandoned elderly people. Each person we helped felt like a small victory against the culture of disposability that treated aging parents as inconveniences rather than human beings deserving of respect. There's something else, Patricia said, pulling out another folder. I've been contacted by the district attorney's office about Blake's case. Apparently, their investigation has uncovered some interesting information about his financial situation. Looked up from the foundation documents, curious about what might have prompted official interest in my son's affairs. It turns out that Blake and Karina have been living well beyond their means for years. They've got massive credit card debt, an underwater mortgage, and Blake's business has been struggling financially. The district attorney believes that one of their motivations for abandoning you was to avoid the potential cost of elder care while positioning themselves to inherit your estate as quickly as possible. The revelation didn't surprise me as much as it might have 6 months earlier. I'd come to understand that Blake's entire adult life had been built on a foundation of entitlement and poor decision-making, enabled by my willingness to bail him out whenever his choices caught up with him. Are they pursuing charges? I asked. They want to, but they need your cooperation as the victim. The case would be stronger with your testimony about the deception and abandonment. I considered the question carefully. 6 months ago, I would have instinctively protected Blake from the consequences of his actions, just as I'd done throughout his life. But the woman who had raised him to believe he could treat people badly without facing repercussions was gone, replaced by someone who understood that accountability was often the most loving gift you could give someone. Yes, I said finally. I'll testify. Blake needs to learn that his actions have consequences, and other elderly people need to see that this kind of abuse won't be tolerated. Patricia smiled. I was hoping you'd say that. The district attorney thinks they can get convictions on elder abuse, fraud, and false imprisonment charges. Blake could be looking at significant jail time. That evening, as I sat on my front porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and orange, I reflected on how completely my life had changed. The woman Blake had tried to discard had not only survived his betrayal, but had used it as a catalyst for building something beautiful and meaningful. My phone buzzed with a text message from Preston, Murphy, and Jade's oldest son, who had become like a surrogate son to me over the past months. Dinner tomorrow at 6? Mom's making your favorite pot roast, and the grandkids want to show you their school projects. This was what real family looked like. People who included you in their lives because they enjoyed your company, not because they felt obligated. People who celebrated your successes and supported you through difficulties without keeping score or expecting payment. I thought about Blake and Karina, probably sitting in their overpriced house right now, arguing about money and blame, unable to understand how their calculated cruelty had backfired so completely. They'd wanted to eliminate an inconvenient mother and claim her inheritance. Instead, they'd lost both the money and any hope of a genuine relationship with me. The cottage around me was filled with gifts from my chosen family, quilts Jade had made, flowers from Murphy's garden, artwork from the grandchildren who called me Grandma Daphne without any prompting from their parents. These people had embraced me not because they had to, but because they wanted to. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, I felt a deep sense of contentment that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with finally understanding my own worth. Blake's abandonment had been devastating at the time, but it had also been the key that unlocked a door to a life I never would have discovered if I'd remained trapped in the pattern of enabling his selfishness. I was 70 years old, and for the first time in decades, I was exactly where I belonged. 1 year after Blake abandoned me at Murphy's Gas and Go, I stood in the courthouse where he was being sentenced for elder abuse, fraud, and false imprisonment. The judge had just handed down 18 months in jail, followed by 3 years of probation, plus restitution for the emotional and financial damages he'd caused me. Karina sat in the back row, her face pale with shock and anger, finally understanding that their actions had consequences they couldn't charm or manipulate their way out of. As Blake was led away in handcuffs, he looked back at me with an expression I'd never seen before, genuine remorse mixed with something that might have been respect. For the first time in his adult life, he was facing the real results of his choices, and there was no mother rushing to rescue him from the uncomfortable reality he'd created. "Do you feel satisfied?" Patricia Stone asked as we left the courthouse, together. "I feel complete," I said, choosing my words carefully. Not satisfied in a vengeful way, but complete in knowing that justice was served and other elderly people might be safer, because Blake's case sent a clear message about consequences. The year since my abandonment had been the most transformative of my life. The Frank and Daphne Russell Foundation for Elder Abuse Survivors had helped 43 elderly people escape abusive situations, providing them with emergency housing, legal assistance, and the emotional support needed to rebuild their lives. We'd opened a transitional housing facility with 12 apartments, staffed by social workers and volunteers who understood that dignity and independence were more important than mere safety. Murphy and I had expanded the gas station into a full-service truck stop with a small restaurant, and the business was thriving under our joint management. More importantly, I'd discovered skills and talents I never knew I possessed, finding purpose and excitement in work that felt meaningful rather than just necessary. But the most profound change was in my understanding of family itself. The Mendoza family had officially adopted me as their matriarch, including me in every holiday, celebration, and milestone. When Preston's oldest son graduated from high school, I sat in the front row with Murphy and Jade, beaming with pride as if he were my own grandson. When Eliza was promoted to principal at her school, I was the first person she called to share the news. "Grandma Daphne?" asked Sophia, Murphy and Jade's youngest granddaughter, as we sat on my porch one evening watching fireflies dance in the twilight. "Do you miss your real family?" It was an innocent question from a 10-year-old who couldn't yet understand that family wasn't about blood, but about choice and character. But it gave me an opportunity to share something important with her. "Sophia, sweetheart, you are my real family. All of you are. Family isn't about who you're related to. It's about who shows up for you when you need them, who celebrates your successes and comforts you during difficult times, who chooses to love you not because they have to, but because they want to." She nodded solemnly, then brightened. "So that means you chose us, and we chose you?" "Exactly. And that makes our family bond even stronger than the kind people are born into, because we made it ourselves." The foundation had brought me into contact with hundreds of elderly people whose own families had failed them, and I'd learned that my experience with Blake wasn't unique or even unusual. Adult children were increasingly viewing their aging parents as inconveniences rather than family members deserving of respect and care. But I'd also met countless examples of chosen families, Communities of support built on mutual respect and genuine affection rather than obligation and guilt. My phone buzzed with a text message from David, Blake's youngest brother, whom I'd reconnected with during the legal proceedings. Unlike Blake, David had been horrified by what had happened to me and had offered genuine support and apologies for his brother's behavior. We were slowly building a relationship based on mutual respect rather than the toxic dynamics that had defined my relationship with Blake. Aunt Daphne, the message read, wanted you to know that Blake wrote you a letter from jail. I have it, if you want to read it, but there's no pressure. Also, Sarah and I would love to have you for Thanksgiving if you're free. David's offer represented something Blake had never provided: inclusion without conditions, respect without strings attached, love offered freely rather than withheld as a tool for manipulation. As I sat on my porch that evening, surrounded by the sounds of my chosen family preparing dinner in the cottage next door, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this place. Blake's betrayal had been devastating at the time, but it had also been the catalyst for the most authentic and fulfilling period of my life. I thought about the woman I'd been a year ago, desperate for scraps of attention from people who didn't value her, willing to sacrifice her dignity for the illusion of family connection, convinced that love meant endless giving without expectation of return. That woman had died at Murphy's Gas and Go, abandoned and alone in a truck stop motel room. In her place was someone stronger, wiser, and more selective about where she invested her emotional energy. Someone who understood that saying no to people who treated you badly was actually saying yes to people who treated you well. Someone who had learned that the most powerful thing you could do was walk away from situations that diminished your worth and toward people who celebrated your value. The cottage around me was filled with laughter, warmth, and the easy affection of people who had chosen to make space for me in their lives. These relationships weren't built on obligation or guilt, but on genuine appreciation for what each person brought to the family dynamic. As the stars appeared in the darkening sky, I felt a deep sense of gratitude for the storm that had revealed the true nature of my relationships and given me the courage to build something better. Blake had wanted to dispose of an inconvenient mother, but he'd actually freed me to discover what real family looked like. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you turns out to be the best thing that could have happened. Sometimes being abandoned by the people who were supposed to love you leads you to the people who actually will love you. Sometimes you have to lose everything you thought you wanted to find everything you actually needed. The rain had long since stopped, but the life it had washed clean was more beautiful than anything that had come before. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.